Picture the flashing lights and roaring crowds of a global music revolution. You probably imagine a charismatic superstar shaking his hips under a blinding spotlight. The whole world believed this glittering idol single-handedly invented the sound of rebellion. But the true architect of that cultural detonation never stood on a brightly lit stage. Instead, the real king of rock and roll was quietly digging dirt in a Virginia field, and his revolutionary anthem was stolen by an industrious. That nameless laborer sweating endlessly in the rural dirt was a man named Arthur Crudup. Most local folks living throughout the oppressive Deep South simply referred to him as Big Boy. He possessed the massive, imposing physical frame of a deeply seasoned manual agricultural worker. Yet, safely buried beneath that intimidating exterior lived an unexpectedly tender and profoundly quiet soul. His enormous hands were heavily calloused from countless agonizing years of brutal physical toil. Thick, stubborn Mississippi mud permanently stained the deep, weathered creases of his remarkably rough palms. Those very same exhausted fingers would eventually write the absolute musical genesis of rock history. However, basic daily survival in the blistering agricultural fields demanded his complete and unwavering focus. Daily existence in the fiercely segregated rural South offered nothing but relentless and severe economic poverty. Dilapidated, rotting wooden shacks stood precariously along the dusty edges of seemingly endless cotton fields. Desperate working men like Arthur earned barely enough copper pennies to adequately feed their families. The violently oppressive summer heat made every single lungful of air feel remarkably heavy today. But what happened next behind those closed wooden doors will completely surprise you today. During those fleeting evening respites, Arthur would gently embrace a remarkably cheap, worn acoustic guitar. His giant calloused and muddy hands plucked those fragile metal strings with an impossible, breathtaking grace. He frequently sang raw and unpolished blues melodies that echoed hauntingly across the silent fields. The surrounding night air eagerly absorbed the heavy sadness pouring directly from his massive chest. His powerful singing voice carried the profound and unspoken sorrow of countless marginalized Southern workers. He certainly never received any formal musical training during his painfully difficult and impoverished childhood. Instead, he naturally channeled the steady and rhythmic striking of heavy iron axes against wood. Every single raw lyric perfectly reflected the inescapable harsh reality of his endlessly grueling existence. This remarkably gifted musician was actively creating a completely revolutionary artistic sound from pure scratch. He was unconsciously blending aggressive rural blues with a uniquely energetic and driving rhythmic tempo. The infectious musical groove he invented possessed the dangerous capability to move entire global generations. Yet, this immense cultural treasure remained tragically trapped within the confines of a dilapidated shack. How could such an unparalleled musical genius remain completely invisible to the wealthy outside world? The deeply unfortunate reality was that America only valued his raw physical labor right then. White society viewed him strictly as another expendable tool designed for endless agricultural harvesting production. Nobody walking past those muddy fields ever stopped to truly listen to his magnificent voice. Now listen carefully, because this specific moment permanently changes the trajectory of modern music. He gradually began performing his highly energetic songs at small and intensely crowded evening gatherings. Fellow tired laborers would temporarily forget their immense daily physical pain while directly listening to Arthur. His uniquely accelerating guitar rhythm unconsciously laid the vital foundational bricks for something entirely new. We must acknowledge the incredibly vast divide separating his brilliant artistic mind and brutal reality. He was unknowingly writing profound melodies that would eventually generate millions in future corporate revenue. Meanwhile, the original creator still lacked enough actual cash to purchase suitable winter working boots. The immense economic value of his vibrant imagination heavily contrasted with his severely impoverished lifestyle. This quiet and towering laborer unknowingly held a winning lottery ticket he could never cash. Despite his physically intimidating stature, Arthur remained an incredibly naive and wonderfully trusting rural man. He possessed absolutely no sophisticated understanding of complex legal laws or manipulative music industry contracts. He solely wanted to freely play his beloved wooden guitar and adequately feed his family. That pure and uncorrupted innocence would tragically transform him into the perfect target for exploitation. The brutal Southern economy eventually forced him to consider abandoning his familiar rural hometown entirely. He realized that casually singing on dusty street corners would never actually break his financial chains. He critically needed to push those rough and muddy hands toward a drastically different direction. An upcoming fateful journey would officially introduce his raw musical genius to the greedy corporate machinery. The wealthy northern record labels were aggressively searching for fresh, authentic sounds to easily exploit. They fully understood that poor, uneducated rural workers desperately needed fast cash for mere physical survival. These corporate entities built massive, glittering empires by continuously harvesting the pure creativity of vulnerable laborers. Arthur unknowingly carried a spectacular goldmine hidden deeply inside his rough and calloused working hands. He was the absolute greatest anomaly of the deeply impoverished American South during that era, a magnificent musical architect completely disguised as a heavily sweating and entirely forgettable field worker. He planted the incredibly fertile rhythmic seeds that would eventually grow into a massive global empire. He quietly possessed the extraordinary creative vision of a king, trapped within a humble peasant body. But the deeply entrenched systemic injustice was already patiently waiting in the dark shadows. The entire commercial system was meticulously designed to extract his raw and brilliant artistic value. They eagerly wanted his spectacular southern art, without fairly compensating the desperate and starving artist. The true musical creator remained completely trapped within the unforgiving and utterly silent black dark. The muddy fields of the American South offered only back-breaking labor and generational despair. Millions of weary souls packed their belongings to seek salvation in northern industrial hubs during the Great Migration. They chased whispers of decent wages within sprawling steel mills and booming modern factories. It was a desperate gamble for basic human dignity in a relentlessly unforgiving era. Arthur found himself crammed into a stifling train car, hurtling away from everything familiar. The rhythmic clacking of steel wheels sounded like a steady heartbeat of highly uncertain hope. He left behind the sweltering heat of dirt roads for an entirely foreign concrete world. He was just another faceless dreamer escaping the crushing gravity of extreme rural poverty. Arriving in the northern metropolis delivered a brutal shock to his gentle rural soul. Towering stone buildings blocked the sun and cast long shadows over icy winter pavement. He wandered crowded avenues feeling completely invisible among thousands of rushing urban strangers. The overwhelming isolation weighed heavier than any heavy sack of cotton he ever carried. The grand promises of glorious factory jobs quickly evaporated into the harsh reality of urban struggle. Employers routinely turned away men like him, leaving him stranded on unfamiliar frozen pavements. The vibrant industrial utopia he was promised proved to be a very cruel mirage. He was trapped in a vast maze of towering concrete without a single real friend. But what he did next in those frozen shadows would eventually rewrite American history. To fight off the agonizing cold and deafening silence, Arthur grabbed a battered wooden guitar. He poured his profound homesickness into raw acoustic chords on lonely urban street corners. His massive hands plucked the steel strings with a heavy rhythm born purely from survival. His booming voice carried the authentic grit of a man who had lost absolutely everything. Pedestrians rushing past could feel the genuine anguish vibrating through the frigid northern air. He was unintentionally forging a revolutionary rhythmic sound just to keep his own heart beating. The lonely outsider was unconsciously laying down the absolute fundamental foundation of modern rock. He did not play for fame or grand artistic recognition in those bitterly cold early days. Every single note was simply a desperate plea for spare coins to buy warm dinner. He sang his deep pain loudly to anyone willing to pause in the freezing winter wind. It was a beautiful tragedy that quickly caught the ear of predators waiting in darkness. The bustling city ignored his quiet suffering, while unknowingly absorbing his monumental musical genius. He became a living ghost, haunting the windy sidewalks with his profound southern melodies. This desperate daily routine eventually led him straight into the waiting jaws of the recording industry. His pure art was about to be turned into a highly profitable corporate commodity. The biting, relentless wind of Chicago pushed him toward a towering concrete giant. It was a monolith of commerce reaching greedily into the grey skyline. Inside, the heavy oak doors muffled the chaotic, echoing street noise completely. The air smelled intensely of polished leather and expensive cologne. Arthur stepped onto the carpet with mud still clinging to his boots. He stood nervously in the center of an opulent, dimly lit, luxurious corner office. Heavy velvet curtains blocked out the harsh reality of the struggling city below. Across the mahogany desk sat a man who dictated industry rhythms. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit costing a small fortune. His gold watch gleamed faintly under the warm glow of a desk lamp. The record executive leaned back slowly into his deeply cushioned leather chair. A thick Cuban cigar rested casually between his perfectly manicured soft fingers. Plumes of fragrant grey smoke spiraled upward toward the intricately painted ceiling. He looked at the giant, weary musician with a calculated, predatory calmness. A faint half-smile touched his lips as he exhaled a long, cloudy breath. Arthur's stomach twisted with a hollow ache that had lingered for days. He had not eaten a proper meal since crossing the state line. The executive knew this silent desperation without needing to hear a single word. He understood that poverty possessed a distinct scent no cologne could mask. This was a game of leverage played against a man holding absolutely nothing. But what happened next was one of the cruelest swerves in musical history. The executive did not offer a partnership or a share of future glories. Instead, he slid a remarkably thick stack of crisp papers across the polished wood. The document was an impenetrable labyrinth of complex legal jargon and hidden clauses. It was drafted in a language that a weary laborer could never decipher. Every paragraph was a meticulously designed trap disguised as a golden opportunity. The terms spoke of exclusive rights, master ownership, and perpetual royalty transfers. But Arthur only saw the confusing maze of black ink on stark white paper. His eyes strained to make sense of the dense, merciless legal terminology. He was a brilliant fretboard master, but entirely defenseless in this quiet arena. The executive spoke in a smooth baritone that promised immediate salvation. He casually pushed a small, neat stack of green bills toward the exhausted artist. It was a flat fee offered as an act of profound charity. The money was barely enough to cover a month of cheap rent and groceries. Yet to a starving man, it looked like an unimaginable fortune falling from heaven. He softly assured Arthur that this was the standard practice for new talent. There was no mention of publishing rights or the immense value of original compositions. The narrative woven in that smoky room was one of immense favour and risk. The label was supposedly taking a massive gamble on an unproven southern labourer. The meagre cash was framed as a protective, upfront guarantee. Arthur stared at the money, while his calloused fingers twitched nervously. He thought of the gnawing hunger and the cold nights in cramped boarding houses. The instinct to survive drowned out any faint whisper of caution or hesitation. Could he really afford to walk away from a warm meal and a bed? The sheer exhaustion in his bones made the final decision for him entirely. The executive smoothly offered a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen across the desk. It caught the dim light, looking more like a weapon than a writing instrument. Arthur took it with a hand that spent decades wrestling with hard earth. He slowly pressed the metal nib against the crisp, unforgiving white paper. With a few shaky strokes, he traded his immortal soul for a momentary meal. The executive carefully pulled the signed document back across the mahogany surface. His half-smile widened just a fraction as he blew another ring of fragrant smoke. He neatly tucked away a piece of paper that would soon rewrite cultural history. Arthur picked up the small stack of bills, feeling a sense of fleeting relief. He thanked the man profusely, completely unaware of the empire he had just surrendered. He walked out of that skyscraper with a full pocket and an empty future. The heavy oak door swung shut, sealing away the quietest heist ever pulled. No guns were drawn and no alarms ever rang in the night. A musical genius had been legally stripped of everything he would ever create. It was the perfect robbery, committed entirely with a smile and a fountain pen. In the sweaty heat of July 1954, a historic cultural detonation completely shattered the foundation of American entertainment. A young charismatic singer casually walked into a Memphis recording studio and laid down a remarkably upbeat track. The conservative national radio airwaves predictably caught fire almost instantly upon release. Overnight, this rebellious new sound triggered a massive wave of moral hysteria across the entire nation. Hordes of teenagers swarmed local record stores with an insatiable hunger for this thrilling electric noise. Anxious parents panicked deeply, while aggressive radio DJs spun the vinyl until the grooves completely wore out. But here is where the story gets incredibly interesting for the men in tailored suits. The explosive popularity of this single record quickly birthed an unprecedented American financial empire. Major broadcasting networks eagerly transformed this raw adolescent frenzy into a highly profitable, perfectly polished television product. Record executives in towering city skyscrapers suddenly found themselves swimming in an ocean of unimaginable wealth. Glistening Cadillacs rolled out of luxury showrooms, and magnificent estates were purchased with massive royalty checks. The American music machine successfully crafted a dazzling, flawless illusion of boundless creative prosperity. Flashbulbs exploded endlessly as the handsome new monarch of rock confidently claimed his glittering throne. Glossy magazines printed countless pages celebrating this monumental, world-altering shift in modern pop culture. Every single spotlight was carefully directed toward this shiny, manufactured narrative of the ultimate American dream. Behind closed doors, the legal system worked flawlessly to protect its newly minted corporate royalty. Complex publishing agreements ensured that the massive roaring river of cash flowed exclusively upward. The general public remained completely mesmerized by the beautiful, glamorous surface of the booming music industry. Tens of millions of dollars exchanged hands during this frantic, unprecedented golden rush of the decade. Sold-out concert arenas roared with deafening applause for a magnificent song that seemingly materialized from nowhere. The entire entertainment apparatus celebrated this massive victory while actively ignoring the roots of the sound. Absolutely nobody bothered to question where that brilliant, infectious melody had actually originated in the first place. The mid-1950s brought an unbearably oppressive summer heat across the segregated American South. The relentless afternoon sun ruthlessly punished anyone working beneath its blinding white glare. The stagnant southern air tasted thickly of dry dirt and profound economic desperation. A massive figure stood completely drenched in sweat while lifting heavy agricultural cargo. His exhausted muscles burned fiercely with every single agonizing and repetitive physical movement. The suffocating rural silence was continuously broken by the rhythmic thud of boots. He paused momentarily to wipe the stinging salt from his deeply exhausted eyes. Nearby, a battered portable radio sat quietly on a rusted metal truck bumper. The exhausted laborers desperately needed some brief distraction from their endless physical misery. That scratched plastic device served as their only fragile connection to the world. It usually played mundane local advertisements or completely irrelevant daily agricultural weather reports. Nobody expected anything remotely profound to emerge from that cheap and broken speaker. But what happened next on that afternoon will completely surprise you today. A sudden burst of frantic static erupted violently from that dented metal box. The lazy afternoon broadcast unexpectedly transitioned into a wildly energetic and driving rhythm. A remarkably familiar acoustic guitar riff aggressively sliced right through the thick humidity. Those specific vibrating notes carried the exact, undeniable genetic fingerprint of his soul. It was the precise musical architecture he had carefully constructed in complete poverty. Then a youthful white voice energetically began singing those deeply personal blues lyrics. The invisible radio announcer proudly proclaimed this explosive sound as a revolutionary phenomenon. The upbeat tempo perfectly mirrored the aggressive chopping of wood from his past. Every single lyrical inflection was completely stolen directly from his own midnight performances. The energetic broadcaster wildly praised this fresh and entirely unprecedented modern musical style. They loudly declared the absolute birth of a completely new cultural youth movement. Any normal person witnessing this exact cinematic moment would naturally assume a victory. They would confidently picture a massive incoming wave of unprecedented wealth and recognition. The original brilliant creator was finally dominating the prestigious national radio broadcasting airwaves. Surely those glittering northern executives were urgently preparing his massive royalty payment checks. The tragically cruel reality of the situation painted a vastly different picture entirely. Arthur stood perfectly still while listening to his own stolen genius echo away. He slowly looked down at his violently calloused and permanently dirt-stained tired fingers. Those remarkably rough hands were desperately struggling to simply provide a basic meal. The massive cultural explosion he personally ignited left his own family completely starving. His intensely beautiful creation was instantly transforming into a massive global commercial product. That incredibly infectious melody was simultaneously echoing inside countless wealthy suburban teenage bedrooms. Millions of shiny vinyl records were rapidly flying off polished urban store shelves. A handsome young performer was rapidly becoming a completely untouchable global cultural icon. Yet the actual brilliant artistic architect remained completely trapped within an endless nightmare. He possessed absolutely zero legal power to claim his rightful share of the gold. The sophisticated legal contracts had already completely stripped away his fundamental artistic ownership. He was violently forced to silently watch an imposter wear his beautiful crown. A profound and deeply aching melancholy slowly settled over his broad, tired shoulders. He clearly realized his brilliant imagination was actively funding extravagant mansions for strangers. His revolutionary art was feeding the very capitalist machine that actively oppressed him. The upbeat song eventually ended, leaving behind only the harsh crackle of static. The enthusiastic announcer quickly moved on to sell another mundane household cleaning product. The magical and deeply transformative musical illusion vanished completely into the hot air. The brutal southern reality violently crashed back down upon the exhausted working men. He remained a completely nameless ghost wandering inside his own magnificent musical castle. The entire modern world was currently dancing frantically to his deeply painful sorrow. They wildly celebrated the catchy rhythm while completely ignoring the bleeding black creator. It was the absolute ultimate theft ever executed within the modern entertainment industry. The brutal plantation foreman loudly ordered the exhausted workers back to their stations. Arthur quietly bent down to lift another incredibly heavy wooden crate of goods. His spectacular musical masterpiece was officially conquering the entire civilized modern world today. However, the forgotten true king of rock simply returned to his grueling labor. The setting sun cast extremely long and deeply depressing shadows across the fields. He never uttered a single angry word about the massive fortune stolen away. The greatest foundational pillar of American music silently faded into the dark night. The American music industry operated on a brilliantly disguised system of financial smoke and mirrors. Wealthy men in tailored suits built a towering global empire upon deeply exploited artistic genius. They deliberately designed an intricate royalty structure that mimicked fair compensation on glossy paper. In reality, it was a flawlessly engineered legal mechanism designed to siphon every single penny. The complex legal framework served as an invisible concrete cage for vulnerable creative souls. A standard recording contract became the most ruthless weapon ever wielded by capitalist executives. These heavily worded legal documents trapped naive black musicians inside a labyrinth of predatory clauses. Corporate accountants routinely charged these artists for studio time, manufacturing costs, and promotional materials. By the time the intricate ledger finally balanced, the creator magically owed the company money. The brilliant men who actually birthed the revolutionary sound were systematically reduced to indentured servants. But the real secret is how they maintained this brutal financial fiction for several decades. Powerful publishers quietly assigned lucrative songwriting credits to non-existent corporate entities or fabricated pseudonyms. They intentionally split publishing rights among their own shadowy subsidiaries to endlessly dilute the payouts. Whenever a massive international royalty check was finally generated, it simply vanished into offshore accounts. Arthur simply never stood a chance against a ruthless army of lawyers wielding fountain pens. Whenever Arthur nervously visited the corporate offices to demand his rightfully earned financial share, things stalled. The executives offered only polite, condescending smiles while pointing at dense paragraphs of legal jargon. They would casually slide a meager cash advance across the polished mahogany desk as charity. These empty financial gestures were mathematically calculated to keep him just hungry enough to work. He was deliberately starved by the exact same administrative machine that sold his authentic voice. The law technically protected the intellectual property of American citizens with utmost rigorous severity. However, that noble constitutional protection rarely extended to an impoverished black man holding a guitar. His profound cultural contributions were legally classified as free natural resources ready for corporate extraction. The sprawling industry essentially strip-mined his soul, while federal courts nodded approvingly at spotless paperwork. The paper trail was always kept perfectly clean to mask a deeply profound moral rot. He had fundamentally conquered the global airwaves with his intensely raw and authentic sound. Millions of dedicated fans passionately bought records bearing his distinct melodies and powerful rhythmic beats. Yet the towering legal labyrinth ensured that he legally owned absolutely nothing of his legacy. The masterstroke of this grand exploitation was making the victim sign his own tragic surrender. They did not just steal his money, they legally erased his ownership of his own soul. The ruthless march of time eventually dragged Arthur back to the beginning. The brief illusion of musical stardom faded into a distant, bitter memory. He returned to the unforgiving fields of Virginia to survive another harsh winter. His massive frame was now bent from decades of relentless, unpaid physical labor. He traded his guitar for the familiar, heavy handle of a rusted shovel. The world outside his quiet rural town was spinning violently on its axis. Giant stadiums across the globe were packed with screaming, frantic teenagers. Megastars wearing glittering suits were making absolute fortunes from his original chord progressions. The entire modern music industry was essentially built upon his stolen creative foundation. Yet the architect of this billion-dollar empire was quietly digging dirt for pennies. Decades of stress and grinding poverty slowly eroded his once formidable physical strength. The heavy burden of raising a family on meager wages took a severe toll. He developed heart problems that made every labored breath feel like heavy iron. The local medical clinics offered little comfort to an aging, forgotten black laborer. His legendary hands could barely grip a cup of cheap, lukewarm diner coffee. What happened next is the ultimate tragedy of American music history. The royalty checks that should have secured his retirement simply never arrived. Corporate lawyers hiding in glass towers continued to exploit the complex legal loopholes. They successfully blocked every desperate petition his advocates filed during his final years. The system worked exactly as it was maliciously designed to function. In early 1974, his failing heart finally began to surrender completely. He was confined to a sterile, lonely room in a rural Virginia hospital. There were no flashing cameras or adoring crowds waiting anxiously outside his door. The deafening roar of the rock and roll revolution never reached this quiet ward. He faced his mortality with the quiet dignity of a man accustomed to loss. The man who wrote the blueprint for modern youth culture had absolutely nothing. His bank account was entirely empty after a lifetime of creating immense joy. The music executives who robbed him were currently sailing on luxury private yachts. They were sipping expensive champagne while Arthur could not afford basic pain medication. The industry had thoroughly consumed his genius and discarded the hollow, tired shell. When he finally closed his eyes forever, the silence was incredibly heavy. He passed away peacefully but completely destitute in the fading autumn light. His family faced the immediate crushing burden of paying for a simple burial. The creator of rock and roll did not even leave behind a life insurance policy. He died without enough cash in his pocket to buy a decent pair of shoes. The contrast between his silent departure and his loud legacy is deeply sickening. Radios across the country were blasting his infectious rhythms on endless daily rotation. Elvis Presley was sitting on a throne of gold in a Las Vegas casino. The publishing companies were eagerly collecting massive royalty checks from international record sales. Meanwhile, Arthur was being lowered into the cold earth in a borrowed cheap suit. His grave was initially marked by a cheap, entirely unremarkable stone slab. Very few people in the massive music industry even noticed his quiet passing. The magazines that praised the evolution of rock music printed minor, buried obituaries. There was no grand tribute concert organized by the millionaires who sang his songs. The pioneer was buried with the exact same anonymity he was born into. This devastating reality highlights the darkest corner of the entire American entertainment business. The corporate machine demands raw talent but rewards only the ruthless men holding contracts. Arthur gave the world an entirely new vocabulary of rhythm and explosive pure emotion. He offered his soul to the microphone and received a bitter life of suffering. His incredible story is a chilling reminder of how brutally art can be stolen. He never asked to be a global icon or a wealthy cultural messiah. He simply wanted to provide a decent, comfortable life for his growing, loving family. The horrific tragedy is not just that he was robbed of millions of dollars. The true enduring tragedy is that he was robbed of basic human dignity. He birthed a worldwide musical revolution and was literally starved to death by its managers. Ultimately, Arthur rests in absolute peace away from the greedy hands of executives. The kings of rock will forever owe their glittering crowns to a peasant. The music lived forever, but the genius was intentionally left to rot in poverty. Arthur Crudup remains the great tragic anomaly of early American rock. He was a truly gentle giant standing among ruthless corporate recording sharks. He looked directly at a glittering empire built on exploitation and answered it with pure soul. His raw vulnerability ran decades ahead of the greedy world surrounding him. He treated his own immense talent not as a weapon, but as a simple fact of life. He treated the music itself as the only subject finally worth his bleeding fingers. He preferred to pour his quiet agony into his wooden guitar rather than demand loud justice. This was a noble habit that ultimately cost him everything he rightfully deserved. The global grief for his unacknowledged contribution remains vast and strangely tender today. Devoted purists have tried and narrowly failed to elevate his original recordings to mainstream glory. His stolen anthem echoes through massive stadiums that he could never afford to enter. His ghostly voice still haunts the very foundation of modern American pop culture. Now listen carefully, because the real secret lies in the ink, not the guitar strings. The glittering stage lights always blind us to the shadowy figures operating behind the heavy curtains. We foolishly worship the charismatic performers, shaking their hips under the bright neon glow. But what happened next will completely change how you view your favorite timeless records. The brutal truth of this ruthless American entertainment machine is devastatingly simple. In this unforgiving industry, raw musical geniuses are the ones who actually create history, but only those cold executives holding the pen to sign contracts get to rewrite it. They quietly erase the original architects while legally pocketing the massive generational wealth. Well, whatever your personal opinion is on the origins of rock and roll, this tragic saga forces us to question the shiny legends we have blindly accepted. The towering myth of the American dream often hides a much darker, exploitative reality. So, how do you truly feel about this hidden dark side of the music industry? Think about those empty royalty checks that never reached that dusty Virginia farm. Imagine the profound silence of a true pioneer, dying without a proper pair of shoes. His brilliant melodies continue to generate millions of dollars for massive corporate publishing houses today. Yet his own bloodline was left to inherit nothing but a forgotten, stolen legacy. This heartbreaking story gives the absolute lie to the idea of fair artistic compensation. It proves that the future of pop music sprang from stolen roots and broken promises. The people who drew the original creative map died in absolute, crushing poverty. Meanwhile, somebody else grew unimaginably rich simply by selling that exact same map. I genuinely want to hear your thoughts on this brutal historical injustice. Let me know your perspective down in the comment section below right now. Do you think modern artists are still falling into these exact same legal traps today? We can uncover more of these buried industry secrets in our upcoming deep dives. Make sure to have a close look at our other investigative historical documentaries. You should definitely check out the Forgotten Pioneers playlist linked right on the screen. The truth behind the music is always much darker than the catchy melodies suggest. I have been Johnny, so I will see you all next time. Cheers.